Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. And I am seeing you once again with lecture 6 of modern novel, that is novel 2. What we were discussing the last time in lecture 5, we were trying to cover a discussion on the chapters, and along with discussing the summary of the chapters, I tried to provide some of the critical analysis based on that. So we are going to continue with a discussion on story development and critical analysis of chapter 3 and section. We will try to finish it by section 4, or maybe we can go a little longer too. That depends on the discussion length. And once we are able to finish our discussion on chapters, we will start our discussion on references from the text, and I'll try to let you understand how we can explain, provide our explanations, provide our reflections on these important lines, and when we are explaining them, how to bring in the quotes and bring in the material that can substantiate our logic or argument. And if we get time, we may also get into the discussion of critical questions of the story. So let's start with today's talk. What I left you yesterday, I left you with the beginning of chapter 3, and probably we had covered section 1 of chapter 3 as well. Now, what is happening in scene 2 of chapter 3? That Stephen is sitting in a chapel as Father Arnold appearing as a guest lecturer in Stephen's new school, and he reads a verse from the book of Ecclesiastes. The sight of this teacher reawakens Stephen's childhood memories of the Woods College, especially the time he was thrown into cesspool, the square ditch, and his subsequent recuperation in the infirmary, where initially when he got sick, he was submitted to infirmary. Now, what is happening that Father Arnold announces to the students that he is there to announce a retreat marking the day of St. Francis, patron saint of the college. The retreat, he explains, will not be simply a holiday from classes, but a withdrawal into inner contemplation of the soul, and of the soul's need to heed the 4 last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell. That means the process of reward. And I must tell you here that this was the sermon, and this was the point where things revealed to Stephen for one change in his life, and that pushed him from the extremes of sinful life to extremes of piety, extremes of spiritual experience. So that marks a major movement in the life of the writer as well as of the hero in the story. Father Arnold urges the boy to put aside all worldly thoughts and win the blessing of the soul's salvation, and meditate. Walking home in silence with his classmates, Stephen is aggrieved by the thought of the rich meal he has just eaten, and thinks it has made him into a bestial and greasy creature. The next day he falls even deeper into despair over the degraded state of his soul, and he is really upset, thinking and rethinking about what kind of sinful life he's leading. Suffering in agony and feeling a death chill, he is feeling inside a need to reconcile with his soul, a need to reconcile with nature, and a need to reconcile with whatever truth is there in the universe. He imagines his weak and rotting body on its deathbed, unable to find the salvation it needs. And what is dreading him now? It feels that he has done all what he could do in his life, and now what he's thinking his point to finish, and not getting what his soul wants for. Even worse, he pictures the day of judgment, when God will punish him punish sinners with no hope of appeal or mercy. And these realizations shake him bad. Crossing the square, Stephen hears the laugh of a young girl. He thinks of Emma, painted by the thought that his filthy sexual escapes with prostitutes have soiled Emma's innocence. With feverish regret, he recalls all the whores with whom he has committed sins of the flesh. With this fit of shame passes, Stephen feels unable to raise his soul from its abject powerlessness. God and the Holy Virgin seem too far from him to help him out, until he imagines the Virgin reaching down to join his hands, to hold his hands with Emma's in loving union. Stephen listens to the rain falling on the chapel and imagines another biblical flood coming. Now, you need to think here whether the rain is symbol of mercy, or a symbol of Virgin Mary, or symbol of some forthcoming punishment or sufferings in the writer's or the protagonist's life, because we know that everything that goes on into writing, whether it's an allegory, symbol, or motifs, or these themes, all of them are they are symbolic. They keep meanings inside. So if at this very point he is listening rain falling on the chapel, definitely it will have some meaning more than it appears to. So when the service resumes, Father Arnold delivers a sermon about hell, recounting the original sin of Lucifer and his fellow angels who fell from heaven at God's command. You must be knowing about Lucifer. He is chief Satan. Father Arnold describes the torments of hell in terrifying detail and length, beginning with the physical horrors. He graphically depicts the pestilential air of the place, spoiled by the stench of rotting bodies, and the fires of hell that rage intensely and eternally. And the dialogues from the character and the writing skills of the writer presents the whole situation so vividly that when one goes through it, you feel shivers and you feel, cold stretch in your body. The blood and the brains of the sinner boil with no hope of relief as he lies in hell's lake of fire. Even worse, warns Father Arnold, is the horrid company that must be endured by the hell dweller, devils as well as other sinners. Now I guess you will be able to understand why Stephen was pushed back from the life he was living so far, and what made him enter a new phase of life. The sermon leaves Stephen paralyzed with fear, recognizing that hell is his destination. So now Stephen could not see anything but his bad end coming very soon. After chapel, he numbly listens to the trivial talk of the other students who are not as affected by the sermon as he is. This makes me recall something I heard during discussion when there was a discussion going on Adam and Eve, and somehow this comment came forward that Satan's pain of getting degraded and being pushed out of heaven is so very deep and intense, and that makes him be this revengeful, that he's going to make the whole humanity face that lake of fire in hell as he's going to face, because he knows that it's God's promise that for the sin that he had committed, he's going to be punished for that. So now what he wants, that if he would like to go to hell, why not to take all of humanity there too? So that is what his agenda is. And what I was referring to that when you feel the intensity only when you are aware of the thing. He felt the intensity of being deprived of heaven only because he knew what heaven is about. Now, if we say that the other students were not affected by the sermon as he did, the reason is because he could really relate to what Father Arnold told for a sinner, because he's the one who knows that he has been committing sin. Because just before this, you read that he feels this urge inside, urge to reconcile with nature, urge to reconcile with his sinful, with his innocent life that he left behind somewhere. Because when something wrong reaches its climax, you feel this from within. A need of change comes up since it's natural. So he got numb by listening to those horrifying sermons by Father, because he was really affected and he could really feel what is the intensity of this pain that he is going through, because he knows he has done it. So in English class that was next to it, Stephen can think only of his soul, because now he knows that his soul is diseased. When a messenger arrives with news that confessions are being heard, Stephen tries to imagine himself confessing and is terrified. We know the Catholic religion has this practice of confessions. So although he's not confessing so far, but he's imagining that he has confessed his sins and terrified to think about it. Back in chapel, Father Arnold continues his tour of hell by focusing on its spiritual torments, which horrifying Stephen no less than the physical ones have earlier. Initially, Father Arnold's discussion based on the physical aspect of punishment, and now Father Arnold is extending on his talk by adding the spiritual tournaments that a sinner will face in hell. And it is not less painful for Stephen to listen to than he listened to it earlier. Together with Father Arnold, all the boys pray for God's forgiveness. So what these boys are listening to is making them ask for God's forgiveness. Now, what are the major aspects in this chapter that I could look forward to that need some discussion, critical discussion are here, but please always remember, what I discuss critically, do not take it as something religious. I try to take out the maximum things that appear more important. However, we know that in literature there aren't any single answers. Each eye and each brain behind that eye has its own capacity of thinking, has its own perception. So probably what looks important to me, what you find there, it would look more important to you than this, right? So be critical whenever you are reading and keep tracing the lines that you think demand your attention, and try to then reflect on that critically. So coming back to the point, don't take this critical discussion enough for your preparation and for your understanding. You can always do more than what I tell you, right? What I give you, take it as the minimum possession and try to build on it, right? Okay, so in this section, we see Joyce borrowing from classic works of literature in innovative ways. Father Arnold's vision of hell, which leads to a turning point in young Stephen's life, draws heavily from Dante Alighieri's poem Inferno, which tells the story of Dante's descent into hell. Inferno is a landmark in the genre of spiritual autobiography, the recounting of a soul's progression through righteous and sinful states. Our portrait offers another such spiritual autobiography as Joyce explores his own spiritual history through the character of Stephen Dedalus. Joyce places Stephen's glimpse of hell at the exact center of his novel, giving it a structure similar to that of Dante's Divine Comedy, of which Inferno is the first part. Inferno places the devil at the center of the earth so that the pilgrim seeking God must go downward before he ascends upward towards salvation. And that makes me think that if knowledge is a move from dark into light, then how valuable this dark is, because there it exists, the passage to the door, or probably the key to the door as well. Similarly, Stephen's path has been a decline into sin and immorality that brings him to his fearful central view of hell. Just as Dante's despair is seized by the appearance of the Virgin Mary, beckoning him upward to heavenly union with his beloved Beatrica, Stephen receives a vision of Mary placing his hand in his beloved Emma's. The visit to the Inferno reveals unspeakable torments, but nonetheless offers a way out, a path toward ultimate holy love. Now, in this chapter, Stephen undergoes more than a mere vision to hell. The agonies he suffers during the sermon seem closer to the experience of hell itself, because we know that Stephen is having some extraordinary qualities of vision, of sensing. He can listen to things. He can listen to things which are not happening so vividly that for some time it feels for him that this is the reality. It is not with everyone. There are only few people who can listen to imaginary talk so vividly, can imagine so vividly. So while he is listening to the sermons, this is very interesting aspect that his skills make him and his agonies, as a matter of fact, make him experience all those things that he's listening by Father Arnold, and that adds into his pain, and that is basically building up his way to change the course of his life. He does not simply picture hell's flames in his mind's eye, but actually feels the flames on his body. That's the powerful imagination, so powerful that you can feel the effect of that imagination on yourself physically as well as spiritually. For example, if I'm thinking about fire, my brain's eye gets so powerful that I can feel the heat of that fire too, though this fire never existed. I hope you're getting my point. His flesh shrank together as if it felt the approach of the ravenous tongues of flames. These are the lines which he is, the narrator is telling you regarding the feel of fire that Stephen has at that time, and it'll get very difficult for you to understand whether it is happening in real or at this point Stephen in his own stream of consciousness. In addition, he does not just imagine the boiling brains described by the preacher, but actually senses that his brain was simmering and bubbling within the cracking tenements of the skull. It's such a powerful, I would say, vivid explanation of the whole thing, that although the father told that the sinners will experience a kind of boiling brain effect, but now you must have made tea in your life, or you must have seen making somebody tea or boiling water for the sake of boiling an egg, and you would see that initially water starts boiling and you can see that there are circles being made, and slowly and gradually these circles are turning into some very little ponds which later on get into bubbles. So these circles, when the circles are being made, you call this water simmering, and when this water starts simmering, and you can listen to that sound in water, where water is basically clashing with the boundaries of the pot, and then later on in the second stage it starts getting this tornadoes inside and starts bubbling in the end. And when it starts bubbling, if you are keeping this bubbling water in a glass bowl, you will see that a point would come that the bubbling water, although we do not keep a glass bowl on fire directly, but if you put it for an experiment, you will see that a point would come that this bubbling water initially would cause cracks in the boundaries of that glass bowl, and eventually will end into a blast of breaking the bowls altogether. So this is what being imagined by Stephen at that time, and this glass bowl is basically what I am telling you, I am giving an example, is basically the skull he is imagining, and he's imagining it's his skull that is getting cracked by the heat and the pain of his brain simmering and boiling inside. God forbid. Stephen's close identification with the subject of the sermon sets him apart from his fellow students because he can relate to it, who later chat casually about it. So other students cannot see what he can see, they cannot feel what he can feel, because probably they are not able to relate with it. I give you a simple example of this, that if three of you friends are sitting together and a meal is served, so one of you who will be hungry or hungrier than others, the way you will enjoy the meal, you cannot find that enjoyment in the rest of your friends, because the hunger situation, the intensity of hunger that you have is not the same case with your friends. So when you are hungry or you are more hungry, you will eat with that passion, with intensity, with that want and urge that may not be lying in with the person who is not hungry at all and who had just had his dinner before having this meal with you. So since you are hungrier than other, your want, your need is intense, and since you are intense in your need and in your want, what you will take is going to be intense as well. So this is the case with Stephen and his friends now, that Stephen was in need of knowing, was in need and want of knowing and changing, because he could feel his soul keeping the burden of his sins and his sinful life. So what the kind of want and need for change Stephen could feel at that time was not the same case with his fellow beings. So they were talking all casually about the things happening over there regarding Father Arnold. This similar reaction recreates the fact that Stephen is a social outsider. He experiences spiritual yearnings more immediately and intensely than others, even feeling them physically. So a time comes that your want becomes so intense that you start feeling the effects of that want on your physical self. So it basically, this happens with a very sensitive kind of person. And science would definitely have some logic for it, but you would have seen that when you are very worried, a time comes that you start facing things on your face and your hair start falling off, and you've experienced physical difference and you appear physical changes in your body, because tension and anxiety and depression, it all helps you releasing a hormone in your body that eventually make these changes in yourself, in your physical self. Something similar was happening to Stephen, although I'm not giving you, asking you to relate all this thing with it, but this is just an example that his spiritual yearning, his want was more immediate and intense, that he could feel everything physically because of that intensity. So, Stephen's experience as he contemplates the religious sermon binds his perceptions of past and future. Stephen's horror of hell is largely a horror of sufferings to come in the future, which he experiences as if they are in the present. He lives through his own future death. He himself, his body, to which he had yielded, was dying. Into the grave with it, nail it down into a wooden box, the corpse. So Stephen's imagination carries him still farther into the future, all the way to the equally terrifying judgment day. However, while religion forces Stephen to face the future, it also forces him to confront the past. Father Arnold visits the school like a figure out of Stephen's memory, a ghost from years gone by. Stephen responds to the visit with a return to infancy. His soul, as these memories came back to him, became again a child's soul. Stephen's encounter with the past is more than just memory. It is a momentary change in his very soul. Thus, Arnold's sermon prompts Stephen both back toward childhood and forward toward death, reaching out to both extremes of his life. The novel suggests that the aim of this autobiography and the aim of religion are similar, as both lead individuals to integrate their present, past, and future lives in an attempt to make sense of the whole. Another life, a life of grace and virtue and happiness, and we are starting with chapter 3, section 3 now. It was true, it was not a dream from which he would wake. The past was past. Stephen goes up to his room after dinner in order to be alone with his soul. He feels fear and despair as he pauses at the threshold, worrying that evil creatures are in the room waiting for him. Going in, he is relieved to find that it is just his ordinary room. Stephen feels weak and numb. He admits to himself the horror of all the sins he has committed, and is amazed that God has not stricken him dead yet. Lying down, Stephen closes his eyes and has a fearful vision of a field covered in weeds and excrement, occupied by 6 ghoulish, goat-like creatures with grey skin. This is what he's imagining now. Swishing their tails menacingly, the creatures trace ever smaller circles around Stephen. They are circling around Stephen, slowly and gradually tightening their circle, uttering incomprehensible words. Springing awake from his nightmare, Stephen rushes frantically to open the window for some fresh air. He finds that the rain has stopped and the skies are full of promise. He prays to Jesus, weeping for his lost innocence. Walking through the streets that evening, Stephen knows he must confess. He asks an old woman where the nearest chapel is and goes to it immediately. He anxiously waits for his turn to enter the confessional. When it is finally Stephen's turn, the priest asks how long it has been since his last confession, and Stephen replies that it has been 8 months. He confesses that he has had sexual relations with a woman and that he is only 16. The priest offers forgiveness and Stephen heads home feeling filled with grace. He goes to sleep. The next day he finds himself at the altar with his classmates and receives the sacrament. Stephen imposes a new system of religious discipline upon himself and transforms his life completely. He prays every morning before a holy image, yet his sense of time is lessened by his uncertainty whether his prayers are sufficient to counteract the ill effects of all his sins. He divides his daily schedule into parts that correspond to particular spiritual functions. Stephen keeps rosary beads in his trouser pockets so that he can touch them as he walks. You know what are rosary beads? It's tasbih. And he divides each rosary into 3 parts devoted to the 3 theological virtues. Reading books of devotional literature, Stephen learns about the 3 aspects of the Holy Trinity. Though he cannot understand the solemn mystery of the Trinity, he finds the mystery easier to accept than God's love for his soul. Gradually, however, Stephen comes to accept the fact that God loves him, and he begins to see the whole world as one vast expression of divine love. He is careful not to get carried away by his spiritual trumps, and he pursues even the lowliest devotion carefully. Stephen avoids making eye contact with women now, and sniffs the most objectionable odors he can find, in order to mortify his sense of smell. He never consciously changes positions in bed, despite his attempts at self-discipline. He is periodically tempted by sin and bothered by sudden fits of impatience as when his mother sneezes. Stephen comforts himself, however, with the knowledge that strong temptations prove that his fortress is holding tight against the devil's attack. He asks himself whether he has corrected his life. Now, Stephen begins fervently to apply spiritual discipline onto his life, to his own actions, in contrast to his passive status as a member of the audience listening to Father Arnold's sermon and attempting to understand it academically. Long passages during the sermon make no mention of Stephen's at all, as the focus is on hell itself. However, here we focus on Stephen's reaction, which is no longer passive. His withdrawal into himself is not only described in psychological terms, but in physical ones as well, as when he goes to his room to be alone with his soul. In applying the knowledge from the sermon, Stephen becomes the master of his spiritual fate. Even his dream of hell indicates a more active relationship with the torments he undergoes, as the goat-like devils come from his own mind as his own creations. Since they are products of Stephen's own mind, he can disown them if he wishes. Therefore, as scary as the goat nightmare is, it is something of a release and a relief for Stephen, who runs to the window to be soothed by the fresh air. His decision to confess his sins is the next step in his gradual process of taking control of his spiritual state. Stephen's rigorous program of spiritual self-discipline is impressive and demonstrates his extraordinary earnestness. The unbelieved asceticism that he willingly adopts demonstrates his strength of will and suggest his heroism. Like some of the early ascetics and hermits of the Christian church who lived in the desert and ate locusts, Stephen displays an astonishing ability to overcome his bodily longings and to affirm the superiority of the soul. So in doing so, he proves his similarity to mastery and saints. Joyce, however, suggests that a saint's life may not be desirable for Stephen because that does not match Stephen's nature. Joyce's style, which is richly detailed and descriptive and concretely sensual in earlier sections of the novel, now becomes extremely dry, abstract and academic. So it's not only the change is happening in the life of the protagonist, the change can be seen in the way the writer is putting into the detail. This style corresponds with Stephen's psychological state. As Stephen's becomes more ascetic and self-depriving, Joyce's language loses its colorful adjectives and complex syntax. The very difficulty of reading such dry language suggests the difficulty of the life that Stephen is leading or has decided for himself. Stephen's question at the end of Chapter 4, Section 1, "I have amended my life, have I not?" emphasizes the fact that Joyce himself has amended his prose. Importantly, though Stephen explicitly acknowledges that his life has been changed, he does not say that it has necessarily improved. So this difference that the writer keeps between the verb changed and improved keeps significance. His heroic efforts to deprive himself are really impressive, but do not necessarily make him a better person, or do they? That's a question I'm asking you. And with that, we are starting the Chapter 4, the second and third scene. This was the call of life to his soul, not the dull, gross voice of the world of duties and despair, not the inhuman voice that had called him to the pale service of the altar. Vacation has ended, and Stephen is back in his Jesuit school, where he has been mysteriously summoned to a meeting with the director. Stephen goes to the director and listens to his idle discussion about whether or not the Capuchin priestly robe should be eliminated. The director laughingly refers to the robe as a jupe, meaning skirt in French. Stephen feels awkward. The jupe reference calls up thoughts of women's undergarments in Stephen's mind. Stephen wonders why the director makes mention of skirts, and it occurs to him that the priest may be testing Stephen's response to the mention of women. Well, the director asks Stephen whether he has ever felt he has a vocation and urges him to consider a life in the church. The director says that the priesthood, as Stephen is going to apply for it, is the greatest honor bestowed on a man, but adds that it is a very serious decision to make because there is no going back. At first, Stephen is intrigued by the thought of the priesthood. Wow, what a work to do. And as now we know that Stephen has a different bent of mind and pictures himself in the admired, respectable role of the silent and serious priest carrying out his duties. As he imagines the bland and ordered life awaiting him in the church, however, he begins to feel a deep unrest burning inside him. He walks back home from school and passes a shrine to the Virgin Mary, but feels surprisingly cold toward it this time. When Stephen sees his disorderly house, he knows that his fate is to learn wisdom, not in the refuge of the church, but among the snares of the world. Arriving home, he asks his brothers and sisters where their parents are. He learns that his parents are looking for yet another house because the family is about to be thrown out of its current one. Stephen reflects on how weary his siblings seem even before they have started on life's journey. And in section 3 we see that Stephen impatiently waits for his father and tutor to return with news about the possibility of his admission into the university. Stephen's mother is hostile to the idea, but Stephen feels that a great fate is in store for him. He sets off walking toward the sea, encountering a group of friars on the way. He considers greeting them, but concludes that it is impossible to imagine them being generous toward him. He recites snatches of poetry and regards the light on the water. Stephen comes upon several of his schoolmates who are swimming, and they jokingly greet him as they say his name in Greek. Reflecting on the myth of Daedalus that his name evokes, Stephen ponders his similarity to the fabulous artificer who constructed wings with which he flew out of imprisonment. Stephen is suddenly enraptured by his thought and feels that he will soon begin building a new soul that will allow him to rise above current miseries. At that moment, he sees a beautiful girl wading in the water, her skirts hiked up a little high. He and the girl make eye contact for a moment. Stephen perceives her as an angel of youth, purity and innocence, and of course beauty, and he swoons inwardly. So, in the evening he climbs a hill and watches the moon. Now, although Stephen's path through life continues to be guided by females, the kinds of women who influence him change as he grows older. The Virgin Mary has been Stephen's main object of devotion, but now she seems to have lost her power over him. When he passes by a shrine to the Virgin on his way home from school, he glances at it coldly, no longer stirred by her presence. The school director's odd emphasis on the word jup, meaning skirt, implies that some other women may have replaced Mary in Stephen's heart. Stephen's turn away from the church and toward the world is emphasized when he turns from the Virgin to the beautiful girl he sees bathing. Importantly, this shift occurs directly after Stephen contemplates Daedalus' use of art to achieve freedom, a suggestion that Stephen will do the same. The bathing girl is a secular version of the Virgin Mary, an emblem of a means to rise to heaven, but without the church. Joyce's novels are notable for their allusions to classic works of literature, as seemingly insignificant comments or phrases are often references to other novels, plays, or poems. One of the primary sources on which James draws in a portrait is Greek mythology. The mythic aspect of the novel emerges clearly in his section, in this section with the reference to Daedalus. In Greek mythology, I shared with you when in the very beginning we discussed the touch of Greek mythology, that Daedalus was a renowned craftsman who built a pair of wings with wax for himself and a pair of his son too, in an attempt to escape the imprisonment of the labyrinth on the island of Crete. In this novel, Stephen's view of himself changes when his friends address him with a Greek version of his name. He suddenly begins to reflect on certain affinities between himself and the mythical, fabulous artificer. No longer defining himself through Christian doctrine by relating himself to Christ and Mary. Rather, Stephen turns to pagan sources and inspirations in his quest for self-definition. His name is significant. His first name alludes to the first Christian martyr, Saint Stephen. His surname, however, alludes to a pagan character whose skill allows him to rise high above the world. In this section, Stephen begins to shift his emphasis from his first name to the last name. He dwells on the idea of Daedalus's flight-giving wings, a piece of artisan handicraft that symbolizes the individual's ability to create art and the possibility of transcending worldly woes. Much as Daedalus escaped prison, Stephen dreams of escaping the misery of his impoverished family and narrow, sad life. To Stephen, the vision of his mythical namesake is not just a hint of his own fate, but a prophecy of it, a prediction that cannot be avoided. Stephen's mental image of a hawk-like man flying sunward above the sea strikes him as a prophecy of the end he had been born to serve and had been following through the mist of childhood and boyhood. Daedalus is a symbol of the artist forging anew in his workshop out of the sluggish matter of the earth, a new soaring, impalpable, impressionable being. This vision is not simply an image of his future, but of his childhood and boyhood as well. His vision reveals a hidden thread that connects Stephen's past, present, and future into one organic whole. Most important, perhaps, Stephen realizes that the art that he will forge is not merely a beautiful object, but an entire internal existence. Through his art, Stephen creates an imperishable being, very much like a soul. He will not just create literature, but will create himself. And here we start section 5. Stephen eats a poor meal and examines the pawn shop tickets upon which his increasingly impoverished family survives. Mrs. Daedalus expresses her worry that Stephen's character has been changed by university life. From upstairs, Mr. Daedalus snaps at his son is a lazy bitch. Annoyed and frustrated, Stephen leaves the house and wanders through the rainy Dublin landscape, quoting poems to himself and musing on the aesthetic theories of Aristotle and Aquinas. A nearby clock tolls 11, reminding him of his friend McCann. Stephen reflects on McCann's accusation that Stephen is too socially disengaged. Stephen realizes that he is missing his English lecture, but is not overly concerned. He imagines the students meekly taking notes. On the whole, he is disappointed by university education now. As he walks to the campus, Stephen recollects a visit to his friend Davin, a handsome and athletic boy devoted to the Irish cause. Davin had told Stephen a story about being invited to spend the night with a housewife he does not know. Stephen notes that it is now too late to go to his French class and decides to head for the physics lecture hall, where he runs into the Dean of Studies. The Dean is trying to start a fire, and the two discuss the art of igniting flames. Stephen and the Dean speak about aesthetics, but Stephen is disappointed by the older man's spotty knowledge, and the conversation is awkward then. When Stephen uses the word tundish, referring to a funnel for adding oil to a lamp, the Dean does not know the word, which Stephen concludes must be Irish. Stephen reflects the English will always be a borrowed language for him, acquired speech. Stephen then attends a physics class that is comic and ineffectual. Afterwards, Stephen chats with Cranley, McCann and other classmates, joking with them in Latin. McCann urges Stephen to sign a petition for universal peace. When Stephen seems reluctant, McCann accuses him of being an antisocial minor poet. Another accusation. Temple, a classmate who idolizes Stephen for his independent spirit, defends Stephen. Another student, Lynch, greets them. Devine proudly asserts his own Irish nationalist fervour and asks Stephen why he has dropped out of Irish language class. Davian says that Stephen is a true Irishman in his heart, but too proud. Stephen explains that the soul takes time to be born, longer than the body. Stephen explains his aesthetic theory of the ideal stasis or immobility evoked by a work of art, a theory he derives from Aristotle and Aquinas. He also explains the ideals, integrity, consonance and radiance that he believes every artistic object must achieve. Now what you are listening here, you are listening an artist being born in Stephen after reaching his second extreme of life. Stephen's concept of divinity lies in the aesthetic basically, and now at this point you will see both of these things coming together. His God has withdrawn from the world of men, paring his fingernails in solitude. Stephen's point is that truly transcendent art must be above the common fray of mankind. Lynch whispers to Stephen that Stephen's beloved, an unnamed girl, is present. Stephen wonders whether he has judged this girl too harshly and muses upon her. So what happens as Stephen awakens in the morning in a mood of contentment and enchantment, having dreamed of erotic union with his beloved. Savoring the feeling, he undertakes to write down a romantic poem he has composed. He recollects being together with the girl in a room with a piano, singing and dancing, and remembers that her telling him that she feels he is not a monk but a heretic. And from this point you will find a change in the way Stephen is thinking, Joyce is thinking and writing. Stephen is jerked out of his reverie by jealous suspicions about Father Moran's interest in the girl, Emma. Stephen reflects that the last time he wrote verses to Emma was 10 years ago, after they rode home together on the same train after a birthday party. He accuses himself of folly and wonders whether Emma has been aware of his devotion to him. Stephen reflects that the last time he wrote verses to Emma was 10 years ago, after they rode home together on the same train. He accuses himself of folly and wonders whether Emma has been aware of his devotion to her or not. Stephen feels desire flow through his body and turns again to the villanelle, the poem he is composing. This villanelle is the poem that he's composing for Emma now. The Dean's inability to understand Stephen's use of the word tundish may seem like a minor detail, but it actually symbolizes the clash of cultures that is at the heart of the Irish experience. The Dean is English and represents to Stephen all the institutional power and prestige England has wielded throughout its colonial occupation of Ireland. The Dean is thus a representative of cultural domination. By failing to understand Stephen's word, which is derived from Irish rather than English, the Dean reminds us of the linguistic and cultural divide between England and Ireland. With sadness and despair, Stephen reflects that this divide may be unbridgeable. And his disappointment underscores the discontentment he already feels for stale university life. The episode with the Dean shows Stephen the importance of creating his own language, as the English he has been using is not really his own. He realizes that English will always be for me an acquired speech. I have not made or accepted its words. My voice holds them at bay. Joyce reinforces this idea of speaking someone else's language throughout the novel through repeated uses of quoted speech from a variety of external sources. The opening lines of the novel, for instance, are a child's story told by someone else. Later we find Stephen frequently quoting Aquinas and Aristotle. Yet despite these constant citations, no quotation marks are used in the novel, sometimes making it difficult to tell the difference between a character borrowing someone else's words and a character speaking in his or her own voice. The Tundish episode with the Dean shows Stephen's necessity of making his distinction and the importance of creating a distinctive and truly Irish voice for himself, his identity. Joyce also uses these sections to explore the contrast between individuality and community. On one hand, Stephen is now more of a free-floating individual than ever before. His links with his family, whose sinking poverty level and carelessness repel him, are weaker than ever. His mother is disappointed with the changes university life has brought about in her son, and his father calls him a lazy bitch. So there seems to be a little parental pride or affection to offset Mr. Daedalus' hostility. Moreover, Stephen's social life is hardly any less solitary. He fails to share the ideological position of any of his friends. He cannot adopt the Irish patriotism of Divine or the international pacifism of McCann. Even the fluttering adulation of Temple fails to inspire Stephen. Therefore, having given up hope on family, church friends, and education, Stephen seems to be more alone than ever. This assessment is only partly true. However, as Stephen is never completely isolated in the novel, his family repels him, but he continues to see them and speak to them. And his warm addresses to his siblings shows that he still has family ties. Furthermore, even when composing epitaphs to dead friendships, Stephen is surrounded by his friends and interacts with them in a lively and outgoing way. The proximity of such human relationships is clearly important, as Stephen returns a powerful commitment to his society until the very end of the novel, even when dreaming of fashioning a new soul for himself. So, old father, old artificer, stand me now and even in good stead. In section 3 and 4 of chapter 5, we see that sitting on the steps of the university library, Stephen watches a flock of birds circling above and trying to identify their species. He muses on the idea of flight and on the fact that men have always tried to fly. His thoughts turn to lines from a Yeats play that has recently opened, lines that characterize swallows as symbols of freedom. He remembers having heard harsh criticism of the play, as some young man accused Yeats of libel and atheism. So leaving the library, Stephen walks with Cranley and Temple, who falls into an argument. And Stephen's beloved Emma leaves the library and nods a greeting to Cranley, ignoring Stephen altogether. Stephen feels hurt and jealous and envisions Emma walking home. A squat young man named Glyne approaches Stephen and his friends, and Temple engages them in a religious dispute about the fate of unbaptized children. Leaving the rest of the students, Cranley and Stephen walk on alone. Stephen tells Cranley about an unpleasant conversation he has had at home, and Stephen's mother wants him to attend Easter services in the church, but Stephen no longer feels religious faith and does not want to go. Cranley answers that a mother's love is more important than religious doubts and advises Stephen to go. Cranley gently tests Stephen's new faithlessness by insulting Jesus and closely watching his friend's reaction. Cranley happens to be a very wise boy and concludes that Stephen may still have vestiges of faith. Stephen sadly tells friend that he feels he may soon have to leave the university and abandon his friends in order to pursue his artistic ambitions. Stephen says that he feels he must obey the dictum, "I will not serve," refusing my ideology that is imposed upon him from above, even that of friends and family. Cranley warns Stephen of the risk of extremely solitude, but Stephen does not reply. So what happened in section 4 is that at this point, narrative switches to a journal form, composed of dated entries written by Stephen himself. From a first-person perspective, Stephen records his sacred impressions of thoughts, perceptions, and events of each day. He tells of his conversation with Cranley about leaving the university and mentions Cranley's father. He distractedly muses on the fact that John the Baptist lived on locusts in the desert, and comments on his friendly Lynch's pursuit of a hospital nurse. Stephen notes a conversation with his mother regarding the Virgin Mary, in which his mother accuses Stephen of reading too much and losing his faith. Stephen, however, says that he cannot repent. Stephen speaks of a squabble with a fellow student and of attempting to read 3 reviews in the library. And he records 2 dreams, one of viewing a long gallery filled with images of fabulous kings, and another of meeting strange mute creatures with some different faces. He mentions meeting his father, who asks him why he does not join a rowing club. In his entry dated April 15, Stephen records meeting Emma on Grafton Street. And Emma asks Stephen whether he is writing poems and why he no longer comes to the university. Stephen excitedly talks to her about his artistic plans, feeling very happy about Emma asking him. The following day, he has a vision of disembodied arms and voices that seem to call to him, urging him to join them. Stephen ends his journal with a prayer to his old father, deadless, whom he calls old artificer, to stand him in good state. and we will quickly cover up the critical aspects of this part of the novel. Stephen's long meditation on the birds circling overhead is an important sign of his own imminent flight that he is taking or wants to take. He cannot identify what species the birds are, just as he is not sure about his own nature. All he knows is that the birds are flying as he too will fly. He will build his wings alone, just as his mythical namesake Daedalus alone crafted the wings with which he escaped from his prison. So we see that the birds offer Stephen relief from his daily worries. Although their circles are harsh, the inhuman clamor soothed his ear, in which his mother's sobs and reproaches murmured instantly. The significance of the bird is, however, morally ambiguous. Stephen is not sure whether the birds are an augury of good or evil. So it's a bad symbol or a good symbol. Just as he cannot be entirely sure whether his decision to leave his family, friends, and university will have good or bad consequences, as Cranley warned him. So finally what happens that the birds are a symbol of literature and national politics as well. They remind Stephen of a passage from a recent Yeats play he has just seen, lines that refer to the swallow that wanders over the waters. So as the nationalist play has attracted patriotic criticism, this swallow is a potent political symbol to which Stephen responds deeply. So this was all for today's talk, and we are almost finishing with the last part of the chapters, where Joyce's transition to journal entries at the end of the novels is a formal change that highlights Stephen's continuing search for his own voice. And the journal entry form explores the problem of representing a poem and a person through words. Stephen is no longer being talked about, but an external narrator who's now speaking in his own voice. So this was all about today's lecture, Lecture 6, where we have almost finished with our discussion based on chapters and their critical analysis. However, I would like to revisit the last part of the chapter in our coming lecture, in Lecture 7. And let me quickly go through the thing that you may get to know in the next lecture: references from the text, explanations, and critical questions based on Joyce's use of imagery. This was all for today's talk. I'll see you next time, inshallah. Allah Hafiz.